Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this cold evening. I'm planning to give you a speech, I hope you don't mind, and then I'm going to answer your questions. And my speech is that it's time to get rid of the pillory, making space for civil discourse, and it seems entirely appropriate to have this subject in this body. So thank you for coming. I really welcome the opportunity because we've become so used to speaking via Zoom and Canvas during the pandemic. So it's really a delight to be able to see you here in the flesh and to register you're responding in real time. It's certainly so much more helpful than looking at an image of myself in the corner of the screen. It's difficult, isn't it, communicating with other people when you're simultaneously looking at your own face in the mirror the whole time. I think the pandemic has reinforced the self-consciousness of the digital age. When we engage with others, we're also performing ourselves in public. We've become uncomfortably aware that, like the figures on playing cards, we have a top half and a bottom half, and sometimes the bottom half is still wearing pajamas, though in my case it's leggings. That self-consciousness in the digital arena can make each conversational play seem like a poker game, casual, yet potentially high stakes. Will our remark get a thumbs up by the group or a thumbs down? Will our cat become an overnight sensation? Tonight, I'd like to talk about civil discourse and how it has been affected by digital life. I'd like to say at the outset that while I have aspirations for what I'd like to see in this realm, I'm not here to lecture nor to preach. Instead, I'm genuinely interested in soliciting your ideas about how we can create and maintain a space for civil discourse that is truly open, inclusive, diverse, and lively right here in Oxford, where there's no room for hate speech, for bullying or discrimination, or ostracizing others on the basis of their beliefs or their identity, where we recognize that some of us will disagree profoundly with others in our own community about fundamental issues, but where disagreement and even uncertainty about what one believes can flourish safely without fear or threat or a toxic atmosphere in which intellectual risk becomes impossible. I'd like to briefly consider the situation in which we find ourselves and then talk a little about the future. How then did we get here? The first point to acknowledge is that there is no halcyon past, no golden age in which people from all walks of life converse civilly on equal terms. Oxford has to acknowledge that our history often includes intolerance and exclusion. This university was slow to admit women, slow to award them degrees, and slow to advance them to positions where they had a public platform to speak. Although we're now making strenuous efforts to encourage and enlarge the body of students and staff who are people of color, their voices have historically been unrepresented, often unheard in debate. Our university has not always been a bastion of free inquiry. There were 4 visitations in the 16th century, and then 3 by Parliament during the Commonwealth in the 17th century, and finally 1 more by the restored Charles II in the 1660s. In the words of the Oxford historian, Professor Lawrence Brockless, it was impossible for a revolution in church or state to be effected without first establishing the loyalty of the universities. Solid opponents of change had to be weeded out and persons of the right caliber intruded. So the visitation of 1535 focused on getting rid of canon law and of the scholastic tradition. So the visitors reportedly rejoiced in seeing the front quad of New College covered in the pages of medieval texts, which were carted off for use as scarecrows by a Buckinghamshire farmer. Another commission was sent to purge the Catholics. Indeed, every year between 1559 and the 1590s, a number of graduates were denied their BAs out of suspicion that they were too Catholic. Only one in that time was similarly blocked on suspicion of Calvinism. In the first visitation under the Commonwealth, 10 of 12 professors, 14 of 18 heads of college, all the canons of Christ Church, and the majority of college fellows were replaced. The third visitation abolished the use of gowns, caps, and hoods as academic dress and sought to strip the powers of congregation, convocation, and the colleges in favor of a strong central executive of godly and prudent men. The Vice Chancellor was personally appointed by Cromwell. Then, when the monarchy was restored, a new visitation essentially undid all the actions of the previous 13 years. All of which goes to show just how important it is that universities retain our intellectual freedom and not become organs of any particular political philosophy or party. Now, there were, of course, advantages for my predecessors in these efforts to impose orthodoxy. In the late 16th century, anyone who spoke against the VC's view in convocation would be discountenanced for sauciness, then threatened with imprisonment for breach of the peace or an inquiry into the orthodoxy of their theological views. Oxford's civic history was often bloodthirsty. We've all heard the tour guides describe the burning at the stake in the middle of Broad Street of Thomas Cranmer, Nicholas Ridley, and Hugh Latimer in 1555 and 56, their crime being a refusal to admit to a belief in transubstantiation. Oxford, like other towns, had a pillory, a medieval form of punishment that was not fully outlawed in Britain until 1837. It was near the gallows at the crossroads between Holywell Street, where it met St. Cross Road and Longwall Street. The prisoner in the pillory had their head and arms locked into place, poked through holes in a wooden plank, and was forced to endure the insults of the mob. Now, we perhaps imagine rotten vegetables being thrown at the perpetrators, but in fact, those who suffered the pillory were often subjected to much worse. Dead rats, cats, and dogs were collected from the streets to be lobbed at them. In 1780, a plasterer and a coachman accused of sodomy were pilloried in London. The coachman, William Smith, died. A stranger in the crowd flung a stone at his head and knocked him out. He never regained consciousness. Another man, accused of homosexual acts, took poison to commit suicide before he could be pilloried. So it's important to remember that being publicly reviled has always led to violence. It has always brought people to the brink of wishing themselves dead. In that sense, I believe that social media, where often all we see is a person's head posted for us to scorn, is simply the pillory of modern times. There is, however, something about digital life, and social media in particular, that presses our buttons differently. I'm sure most of us have noticed that we will type things in an email or a tweet that we wouldn't say in person or over the phone. There's a sense of electronic distance in our digital communications, largely because we don't see other people's physical and emotional response to our words. We don't adapt our body language and tone to the conversation empathetically, as most of us do without thinking when we see that we've hurt someone. It's as if we're all astronauts shouting down the line from the vast and echoing chamber of space. Then there's the speed of our digital reactions, the way that dead dogs from Oxford to Oman can be flung around the clock at people who are judged to have offended popular taste or opinion. The second-by-second refreshing of our devices can give us all the anxious sense that we're living in a thriller and missing vital cues. That's potentially overwhelming and quite addictive. An iPhone is much the same size and shape as an old-fashioned pack of cigarettes. I've noticed people frequently playing with their phones in much the same way that I used to watch people chain smoke or turn a cigarette around and around between their fingers. I wonder if the satisfaction of the craving and the stimulation of new craving may be one and the same, whether it's nicotine or the digital pursuit of attention. Of course, the internet and digital communication have also opened vital new possibilities for us of instant global interaction, knowledge sharing, and friendship. I'm no Luddite, yet I can't help wondering if the fact that we live in a digital world based around switches, for all computers are essentially just banks of switches, has increased a danger that was always present in our intellectual life. The tendency to see the world in binary terms, good or bad, right or wrong, thumbs up or thumbs down. All digital life is based on switches that are on or off. Material is visible or hidden. Online communication, whether from friends or strangers, is presented to us as an endless set of binary choices. We either like a post or we don't. We buy a product or we don't. We follow or unfollow. Rather like the hands of the famous preacher in the film classic Night of the Hunter, where the right-hand knuckles spell love and the left-hand knuckles spell hate, our scrolling figures are invited to swipe left or swipe right, to click or not to click. This is no accident. It's how companies aggregate data about us. As digital consumers of ideas as much as of products, we are flickering constellations of desire, described as lights that are either turned on or turned off. This is what enables corporations to market to us more of what we've already demonstrated that we like, in terms of political takeaways as well as pizza. It is how they know how to get our goat and how to get our vote. But the more we allow ourselves unconsciously to be drawn into simplistic binary dispute and binary models of intellectual choice, the more depleted we risk our intellectual lives becoming. In a climate of instant, remote approval or disdain, there are also casualties. Female MPs, activists, journalists, and academics routinely receive threats of rape and other forms of physical violence and intimidation, in addition to the daily grind of being called a sour hag, a prize bitch, or much worse. Anonymity emboldens trolls, as does the rarity of significant punishment for those who regularly overstep the bounds of decency that would be upheld by social norms in any real-world setting. Amnesty International, in a 2018 study called Toxic Twitter, found that a woman is abused on Twitter every 30 seconds. Their study also found that Black women were more likely to be abused. In the run-up to the 2017 UK general election, they found that 20 female BAME MPs received over 40% of the abusive tweets, despite there being almost 8 times as many white MPs in the study. These results can be devastating. We'll never know what potential future female leaders we have lost, who won't be captains on the bridge of politics because of the threatening throes beneath that bridge. It's striking to me as an academic how often it is women who are the receiving end of media pylons and threatening online behavior. My own Wikipedia page has frequently been attacked, and fake Facebook pages in my name have been created. Hélène Cizou famously wrote that for women, speaking, even just opening her mouth in public, is sometimes rash, a transgression. It's an act that has been forbidden in many cultures at many times in history. Although the threat displays of men on social media often do not succeed intellectually in silencing women or dismissing their views, they may succeed in deterring women more widely from entering the public arena and expressing themselves freely. In that sense, the threat is effective, and the result is a diminished public sphere. Dog whistling and catcalling, the deliberate polarization of opinion, with provocations of opponents and intransigence toward any form of genuine negotiation, also increasingly prevents bipartisanship in politics. The filmmaker David Putnam retired from the House of Lords just last month, and he said, "I can't be the only member of the House of Lords who's become increasingly frustrated by the fact that in Parliament, as elsewhere, we no longer engage in debate. We simply trade assertions. Debate, as I've always understood it," he said, "is persuasion based on competing interpretations of evidence and the ability to form a compelling argument and, where necessary, seek compromise. Sadly, that has been substituted by refusal to answer serious questions or offer any well-thought-through arguments in defense of seemingly immutable positions." Binary thinking, of course, predates the computer age. It is implied in every national or political statement that you're either with us or against us. Even the construction of the Oxford Union building, this beautiful Victorian room, the one in which we're gathered this evening, subliminally encourages us with its aisle and two sides, which is deliberately similar to the House of Commons and just like Convocation House, to think in terms of pro and contra debate within a two-party system of government. One side wins, one side loses, with people saying yay or nay. As the Irish novelist Sally Rooney, who was a competitive student debater herself, put it, competitive debating takes arguments' essential features and reimagines them as a game. For the purposes of a game, the emotional or relational aspects of argument are superfluous, and at the end, there are winners. We do not routinely interrogate how exclusionary this model of debate can be, and how many people are put off from participating in political discussion at Oxford and elsewhere, and quite possibly put off from entering politics in their later lives by the combative team sport dynamic that it imposes on collective discussion of complex issues. We respect the binary tradition, and perhaps we should respect it less. My own years of work on terrorism have taught me that terrorists of every ideological hue have one thing in common. They are Manichaean in their worldview. They see the universe in binary oppositional terms, my belief system versus the rest of the world. It is this certainty that enables them to blow up their opponents, to cancel them in a chillingly literal sense. Far too often, governments, even democratic ones, respond in the same Manichaean terms of good and evil. They portray terrorists as one-dimensional bad guys and psychopaths, with no effort made to understand how they came to be, or how they can then win support from broader populations. In my own view, one of the primary values of a university education is that it should rob us of our certitudes. The word university comes from the Latin, universitatis magistrorum et scholarorum, a community of scholars and teachers. Implied in its universitas is the concept of bringing together multitudes, diverse people, topics, ideas, and seeing them collectively as a whole. That is the power of a university, to be an experimental zone where the subject is your own mind. How can you know what you think until you see what you say? How can you feel free to develop, alter, exchange your views if you or anybody else is fearful of the social consequences of being deemed to hold an opinion that is beyond the pale? So I'm wondering, how could we challenge ourselves to move beyond this binary model of thought that dominates us, to be non-binary thinkers? After all, when we consider our friends or colleagues, our opinions of them are complex. We might love their hair and hate their clothes. We might love their cooking, but have our reservations about their musical taste. We might value them as a friend to go out with at night, but not a friend to stay home with in the evening. People are complicated. And when we know them and share a room with them, we usually find that even when we disagree, we can disagree without a fight in which glasses are thrown and police are called. Can we, in seeking a roundtable of civil discourse, then take the social model of interaction and challenge ourselves to see people in the round? Can we be intellectually fluid, passionate and angry when we need to be, free to protest civilly, and eager to use our democratic power to convince others, but slow to pile on us to a scrum on social media, cautious about allowing our buttons to be pressed, to flick the off switch and storm out? Could we also be warier of how social media influence our behavior, and in reading our data for their own ends, which favor antagonism, model us rather than us shaping them? I'd like to think that a calmer, more respectful, and more open approach to civil discourse is possible. I'd like to create a climate in which we can engage in an atmosphere of what Professor Timothy Garton Ash calls robust civility. I'm aware that as I make this appeal for tolerance in our community, you may be trying to place my own agenda on a binary political model. Is she left or right? Is she pro or con? Is this a coded message in support of the recent government's attempts to regulate freedom of speech in universities? I can assure you it's not. I do not support the recently proposed government legislation that seeks to control university unions and debating societies by imposing financial sanctions if It suspects that a proposed speaker has not been invited because students are declined their visits or protested their views. I'm troubled by the notion of a government-appointed freedom of speech czar who can overlook university students and staff deciding whether they had illegally silenced a minister from Israel or an academic apologist for the British Empire, which are the examples given on the government website, and determining that such a person ought to be issued a mandate to speak here or lecture here. Our history of visitations teaches us how damaging and ultimately futile efforts to control speech in universities have been. This legislation falls prey to the most common pitfalls of all legislation on freedom of speech, ceding freedom of speech only to those who agree with us. I oppose the government's Prevent legislation precisely because it sought to limit the expression of certain views, especially views antithetical to British values at universities. In my view, the best place for those views to be heard is at a university in which they can be openly countered. For the same reason, I am personally opposed to efforts to require students to adopt particular definitions of anti-Semitism or of anything else. Universities are the very places in which these definitions should be freely and openly debated. I also worry that this recent legislation is disproportionate to the number of cases of no platforming in British universities, which is actually very small. It seems to me to bode ill for the intellectual independence of universities in general when confronted with representatives of financial and fiscal power wielding a heavy stick. Too often right now, universities are being identified and represented in the media as a problem, as hotbeds of intolerance, dominated by out-of-touch liberal elites who shut down anti-woke views that displease them. Culture wars, cancel culture, no platforming. These media slogans themselves frame debate in binary combative terms, where the university is often painted as the aggressor. In fact, this deliberately divisive view is wildly inaccurate. Universities are and always have been havens of tolerance, trustworthy information and reasoned interpretation, rich ecosystems for thought that in fact are key to preserving society from propaganda, fake news, and polarization. Education is the best key to an open mind. I'd like to protect students from government interference and to champion their own ability to manage the diversity of views in their community. I'd also like to protect Oxford staff. A good deal of my time has been taken up in the last few years by dealing with cases where researchers have been misreported or felt that they were subject to a media witch hunt. Older academics who worry that their careers have been ended, younger ones who worry that their future has been blighted because of a single story where complexity was lacking and intellectual difference has been weaponized into disgust. Once we begin to see intellectual analysis that produces verdicts we dislike as inimical to the will of the people, we open the door to the kind of politicization that led in 2016 to the closure of 15 universities in Turkey, and that has driven new laws limiting the independence of the judiciary in Hungary and Poland. I've served on the board of the Central European University in Budapest. President Orbán objected to the CEU's outspoken liberal values and trenchant defense of an open society, so he forced the university to either close or to leave. We moved to Vienna. Orbán was once a student at Oxford. Some might even say they were embarrassed that Orbán had studied here, but I couldn't possibly comment. This is happening not in some distant place, in some distant time, but in Europe now. So I'm here to appeal to your creativity and your imagination. How might Oxford model a different way of being in the world, both as individuals and as a community? What steps can we take not to rise to the clickbait that aims to hook us and land us in the thick nets of discord, unable to move forward? Above all, how can we avoid being played by those in corporate or political life who want to render universities less independent and less powerful, dancing to a defensive tune? How can we maintain strong opinions but be conscientious objectors who refuse to enter a culture war that is being stoked by commercial and political forces that profit from conflict? I'd like to make this university a truly safe and welcoming, yet vibrant place for everyone to explore, to find out who they are in terms of their gender and sexuality, but also their ideas in every other area of life. How might we move towards non-binary thought, not us or them, yes or no, black or white, in a way that lets people and intellectual life flourish and develop in all its rich complexity? How can we create space for questioning ourselves, for thinking out loud, for being less intent on winning and spinning, more intent on sharing, deliberating, understanding, and resolving? That might mean organizing debate differently, more roundtables, more events that are oriented towards a goal of participation and inclusion, of maximizing the number of voices we hear, and more flexible formats. It might mean publicly and privately, deliberately seeking out contacts and conversations across a perceived cultural or political divide. It might mean choosing to manage our social media and digital discourse differently. I'm open to your ideas, indeed, I welcome all of them. So thank you for the time you so generously given me to open my mind on this topic with which a lot of us are grappling. I very much look forward to hearing your responses and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Richardson. Thank you so much for your well-phrased and well-delivered speech on civil discourse, something the union is quite proud of. A former chancellor of Oxford University, Howard Macmillan, ex-president, said the union is the last bastion of free speech. But increasingly, in the age of mass cynicism and fake news, people are calling for university to be the last bastion, the bastions of snowflakes. How would you understand the characterization of snowflakes, and how should you encourage students to think differently and to protect themselves from becoming snowflakes?
Thank you. Well, I think that was really the point of the talk, to encourage us to slow down our reactions, for starters, but to engage with people of different points of view, of different beliefs, to be prepared to create an environment where we're willing to allow people to experiment with their views. And the union is a perfect opportunity to do that. I mean, I think the whole speech was an effort to answer that question: how do we engage in civil discourse? So the various points were not to fall into this binary mode of thinking, but to recognize life in all its complexity, recognize that people have different views than us, try and understand where those views came from, engage with them. If somebody has a view you don't like, engage with them, try to persuade them of your point of view, but also be open to changing your own mind. So I do think I think it's a gross exaggeration to say that universities are filled with snowflakes, but that means the impetus is on us, and indeed on you, to prove that caricature wrong.
Mm-hmm. I think it's incredibly right. You said we have to be able to face controversial opinions and then engage with them. So let's start with some of the controversies. One of your comments earlier this year on Michael Gove, who was an ex-president of the union, sparked some controversy, where you said you're embarrassed that Michael Gove is educated here at Oxford for his comments during the Brexit campaign when he said, we had enough of experts. Do you regret making the comment? Do you think his remark is shaking people's confidence in academic institutions that's often being perceived as elitist, like Oxford?
Well, I think his comments were very unwise. And I made that comment as a joking aside on a panel. I did not expect it to be picked up as it was. I was making a joke saying we're an institution dedicated to expertise, to producing expertise, to educating experts. We value expertise. And one of our people said we've had enough experts. So it was I really wouldn't make too much of it. It was a joking aside. And I'm quite sure Mr. Gove, as an experienced politician, doesn't take it remotely seriously either. I do think the whole populist movement, in which there was a challenge to the value of expertise. I mean, if you look at the voting patterns, both on Brexit and in recent presidential elections, there is a growing bifurcation along educational lines. Really, the best predictor of whether somebody would vote for President Trump was degree of education in many parts of the US. And I think that's a very unhealthy divide. I think, and actually that's the point I was making on this panel, and the only point I thought I was making quite an important argument, but the only thing anybody picked up was the joke about Gove. Was about universities can't afford to be isolated from the universities. We're publicly funded from the communities that fund us. And so we have to engage more with the communities around us. And we have to be open to them. We have to convince them of the value of what we do. But this trend against experts, I think, is damaging for universities, and we need to work to counter it, I think.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the more important takeaways from your talk on that panel was you were encouraging to foster ideological diversity. But how do you think university as an institution, the professors and the academics can do that to the students? And how should students to actively seek that ideological diversity?
Well, I'm not trying to flatter you here, but I mean, I think to some extent the union does this by having speakers that some would consider controversial. I think universities should welcome controversial speakers. I mean, I've also gotten into trouble for saying that because I think as a teacher, my responsibility is to model to students how to disagree with people who, in a reasoned way. And I think we really should be open and should insist when we teach on hearing different points of view and modeling to our students how you respond. So again, my whole pitch was not to ostracize somebody who has a view that you find terribly wrong, but to engage with them. And, I'm quite sure Michael Gove would happily engage with me on the question of the role of experts, although his actual original statement wasn't quite as stark as the one that's been associated with him either, but that's neither here nor there. So I just think universities have to welcome diversity of opinion and not shun it. And all legal speech should be welcome on campus. And I will defend anybody's right to say anything that is legal, even if I disagree with them utterly. I'm perfectly happy to defend the right of somebody who says, I as a woman don't have a right to vote. I don't care. I will, all legal speech should be welcome in a university. We're the one place where it should be protected.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's fair to say Gove's comment was similar to your comments, also taken out of context. And especially in an age where the digital media is so quick to pick up on things, we have to be very cautious of what we're taking from them.
And yes, that is true. I do think his original comment was taken out of context, but he never disavowed it either. So I think he delighted in associating himself with the cruder version of it. That lived on.
Whether you're embarrassed by Gove or not, moving on from that, more broadly, I want to seek your advice. For those students who came to Oxford, Oxford had an uncomfortable past. How should you encourage students to reconcile with the past of the institution? For example, we say the statue of Cecil Rhodes.
Well, in Oxford's past, they didn't allow Catholics until 150 years ago. And then for hundreds of years, Oxford didn't allow anybody who wasn't an Anglican until 150 years ago. Oxford was a creature of its past, so there's many aspects of it that we wouldn't associate with today. I think we should be aware of it. I think we can derive lessons from it, and I was trying to derive lessons from the experience of the 16th, 17th century, where there were all these efforts to impose political orthodoxy, which didn't last. I mean, I laughed when I read about the efforts to ban academic gowns. We know how well that went, because given that they're still here. So, sorry, I've lost my train of thought now, but can you remind me what you just asked me?
You were talking about Oxford is a creature of its past.
Past. Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, Our country has an uncomfortable past. History is uncomfortable. We can't disavow it. I think we owe it to ourselves to educate ourselves about it. One of the things I like to do is imagine what future generations will think of us. And I think that keeps you humble if you think about that. Because I suspect if we're as tough, if subsequent generations are as tough on us as we are, as some of us are on some of the people in our past, we'll be in bad shape. We're living through an era of extraordinary inequality, social inequality. We're sitting on our hands when the evidence of climate change is mounting every day. We're living in a world where wealthy countries have vaccines by the boatload, and 5% of the developed world have vaccines. Ethically, I think if future generations apply the standards to us that we're applying to past generations, I don't think we're going to fare terribly well. So we need to educate ourselves about our past, and I think we need to use it as an example and a model to ourselves to try and encourage ourselves to be more ethical than we believe past generations were.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the past and history, your appointment to the Vice Chancellorship made history. You were the first woman in the university's 785 years history to ever become a female Vice Chancellor. Do you feel that there is still an institutional bias against successful women in high-powered places? And what do you think would change that?
No, I don't think there's an institutional bias against successful women. I do think there's enormous pressure on women who do get to positions of authority that women haven't previously held to be successful. And I suspect if women who are the first woman in a role are not successful, the likelihood of their being succeeded by a woman is low, whereas which isn't the case for a man, if you like. But at this, we're living in a period of great change, and I'm an optimist. And I think, if you look at the progression of women since the 1970s, which was when women started engaging at mass level in education, at one level it's pretty disappointing. Every major profession you looked at is shaped like a pyramid. It's true of academia, it's true of most of the professions. And certainly I think we imagined that things would have changed much more rapidly than they have. So on the one hand, that's not so great. On the other hand, when you think of the lives of my mother, I mean, this, what we've achieved is extraordinary. So the pace is slower than I would like, but the trajectory is absolutely clear. And I think, I just look forward to the day when nobody is the first woman anything. And my daughters and granddaughters will not be the first women anything, that my daughters can run against another woman for any office and without anybody remarking on their clothes or on the fact that that's unusual. And I think that day is closer. It's not as close as I'd like it to be, but it's a lot closer than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So we're getting there.
In your time as the Vice Chancellor, what has been your proudest achievement so far?
Oh, there's been a lot. And as Vice Chancellor, you're only as good as the people around you. So the success of the vaccine has been absolutely fabulous. I mean, the fact that this university in 11 months was able to produce a vaccine. Now, the last record for producing a vaccine was the measles vaccine, which took 10 years between 1953 and 63. We just did it in Oxford in 11 months. I mean, that is fantastic. I'm also pretty proud of the changes we've made in the socioeconomic makeup of the undergraduate student body. I think we've made real strides there. And we've also changed the whole culture and attitude, I think, around admissions. We still have a lot of work to do when it comes to graduate admissions. I'm proud of some of the big gifts we've brought in, the gift for the humanities, which is going to enable just the most extraordinary culture centre, performing arts centre in the centre of Oxford. The fact that we brought in £100 million to do work on antimicrobial resistance. I mean, antimicrobial resistance is the next pandemic waiting to happen. It's, again, something that we know is headed our way, that the World Health WHO estimates that by 2050 there could be 10 million people dying a year unless we've managed to address it. So this is a place filled with remarkable people. So seeing them, I see my job as trying to create the environment and the space for them to do what they can, all that they can, and they're doing amazing things, and that's what I'm enormously proud to be part of it.
I think a lot of the students would recognize a lot of your achievement on championing access. At the earlier of the talk, I said with the various initiatives you've committed the university by 2023, 25% of the British student admitted will be from underrepresented background. And last week at the Union, we had a debate on meritocracy. We've got one side of the debate arguing there's no merit in meritocracy, how people are going to Oxford because of their family background, because of their family wealth. On the other side, people argued meritocracy means taking personal responsibility. I wonder, what do you think on that topic of meritocracy?
Well, I'm a meritocrat, but I believe in meritocracy, but I do believe the odds are stacked very much against some people in our community. When it comes to applying to select universities, they've fallen off the educational ladder long before they could be in a position where they could possibly make a competitive application. On the other hand, I think increasingly there are many great foundations. I sit on the board of a couple of them, like the Sutton Trust, the Laidlaw Schools Trust, and of course institutions like ours, which are actively, and all our colleges out there seeking to identify smart students who with the right support could make competitive applications. There's no doubt that it's so much easier if you come from a household with books. I mean, by the time a child begins school, if they're in a household without books, their vocabulary is a fraction the size of a child who's in a house where they're read to and they read. So there are huge socioeconomic, racial, regional inequities in our society, and we can't compensate for them all. So life is easier if you come from a professional background, but I do think we're making concerted efforts to provide opportunities for those from deprived backgrounds to get a fair shake too.
Mm-hmm. One final question from me before I move on to audience question. You've enjoyed a very distinguished, successful career, and you're about to embark on another new journey in 2023. What advice would you give your 20-year-old self, given this is the first term of the academic year? We've got a lot of freshers join as our members.
Oh, I would just say, just take up every opportunity that comes your way. I didn't plan my career. I didn't plan to become a Vice Chancellor. Didn't plan to become an academic. I just took every opportunity that came my way. And my first big break was seeing an ad in the Irish Times for a scholarship to study any subject in the world I liked, any place in the world I liked. And I just thought, wow, I'm a country bumpkin. It would be good experience for me to compete for this national scholarship. I never imagined I'd win it. I just wanted to do it for the experience of the competition, and I ended up winning it, and that's how I first went to America. So I would just say seek out opportunities and take them. And don't try and plan everything, because who knows? Life is a way of getting in the way when you've got very rigid plans, but and anybody who's come to Oxford has got opportunities by the boatload. So I would say take them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And now we're going to move on to audience questions. If you've got a question for Professor Richardson, please put your hand up. I've got a question from the member there.
Yeah. All right, thank you. So you talked about how you oppose this kind of Manichaean worldview in which it's us versus them, which often leads to degradation in public discourse. I completely agree. But I feel like in recent years, we've seen a lot of different political tribes view other tribes as fundamentally evil and therefore not worthy of engagement. And I think perhaps the textbook example of this might be Hillary Clinton calling Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. So I was wondering what thoughts you ever had on, let's say, maybe dispelling that kind of perception that other political tribes are so evil that they're not worthy of discourse or civil discourse.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a fair point. We've seen this is the growth of polarization. I wouldn't have thought the Clinton quote was, I could think of many others, but there has been a growing polarization, particularly in American politics, and it's deeply unfortunate. And you're seeing the absence of a center ground, and historically politics was made at the center, and that hasn't. It's going in the opposite direction in the U.S., and that does tend to have the contagion effect on other countries. So the question is, what do we do about that? I mean, one of my great disappointments in modern times is how few people are really willing to stand up against those who are blatantly polarizing. I guess I would take President Trump as an example here. I mean, I think most of us felt, well, the institutions are strong enough. One maverick politician, there's a limit to what they can do because the institutions are strong enough. But actually, by the end of a four-year presidency, the institutions were really fraying. And we cannot, in a democracy, is not going to function if you consider people who disagree with you evil incarnate. And we should make that kind of language unacceptable. And that requires us as citizens to say to our politicians, to punish those politicians, whether they're on the left or the right, and punish politicians who insist on describing others as if they were evil incarnate instead of just opponents, political opponents.
Great. You have the question from there. Yeah, just pass on the mic.
Thanks for speaking to us tonight. I just had a quick question on the role of universities. You mentioned the growing rejection of expertise and experts in science, and I was just wondering if you thought modern universities had any role in fighting that, and if so, what should that be? Thank you.
Thank you. I do think modern universities have a role. We've got to demonstrate to the public that we're in their interest, that we provide a public good, that I think for many people, universities are places where 18-year-olds go off for 4 years and to grow up, and then that's it, and ideally get the skills necessary to get a better job. And I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is we were able to show society just what we do, because we were able to produce this vaccine in record time because for 30 years there have been people working on infectious diseases. So I don't think we can take our own virtue for granted. I think we have to be very self-conscious about persuading the broader public about the value of what we do. And if the public thinks that our admissions, for example, are unfair, they're not going to support us. So our admissions processes have not only to be fair, but be seen to be fair. We have to demonstrate to the public what we contribute to society. I think we need to be more conscious of our role as a civic institution as well. I mean, yes, we bring so much wealth and spending power into the city, but we also cause a great deal of disruptions in the city. So I like to think about ways in which we can give back to the city, like through our continuing education program and things like that. So I think we have to be very conscious of our role as publicly funded institutions and be willing we've got to convince the public, because ultimately, of course, this is self-interest as much as anything else. Politicians respond to their publics, and if the public doesn't think we're providing value to them, politicians will start cutting our funding. And without public funding, we won't be able to compete globally, and we're really in trouble.
Mm-hmm. To actually follow up on that, you've mentioned in your response, increasingly people send their kids 18-year-old to university to regard that as a 4-year or 3-year of their life experiences. But as more and more parents and more students go to university, people increasingly asking the question, is university right for everyone? What would you say to that?
No, I don't think university is right for everyone. I don't, the government here set a goal of 50%. I think the university should be for everybody who wants to come to university and is qualified to come. But the lack of a vocational track in this country is is very evident, and we need to invest in it. So, I think I'm trying to put this. It's very, it's so easy to get into trouble in my job. I'm trying. How do I say this that it won't get distorted? There are many young people who are going to university today who would probably be better off if they took a different track. It's not students who are coming to Oxford. We're enormously privileged, those who come here. But I think we as a society have to invest in a much better alternative track than universities, and we haven't done that yet. I mean, further education colleges have been chronically underfunded. There isn't a high-status vocational track, and I think we need one. So I don't think universities are the be-all and end-all at all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can I have the member there? Yeah, the glasses.
Thank you very much for your speech, and it's very interesting listening to it in lieu of your speech that you gave at matriculation. I have a couple questions. So a center point of your speech was the non-binary discourse that we have to have in order to break polarization. But if the modern ways of communication, debate, and mass media sort of reinforce these binary decisions that people have to make, and sort of create friends and foes that make it easier to cancel people metaphorically or literally, how could we have that non-binary debate when the very means by that don't reinforce it to have a robust civility? And my second question is, you briefly mentioned that you're against having maybe set definitions for hate speech like anti-Semitism. Would it be counterproductive for conversations if we were arguing more about definitions rather than what actions constituted those definitions?
Okay, thank you. Well, on your first question, that's really my question to you all. How do we do this? If you agree with me that we shouldn't allow ourselves, I think you're right, and that was my point, that we are being drawn into this binary way of good and evil, Manichaean, if you like, and how do we resist that? And if we don't resist it in universities, nobody's going to. So the onus is on us, and I welcome all your ideas if you agree with me. If you don't agree with me, fine. But as to how we can resist it, my objection is that I don't think anybody should be telling people in universities how to define anything, except legislation. I fully respect the right of the government to legislate. That's why I say I will defend all legal speech. Obviously, I won't defend illegal speech. And if the government wants to legislate, which they do, what is discrimination and so on, we will, of course, abide by the laws of the land. But when it comes to something that isn't enshrined in legislation, I think we should be free to debate how we think it applies to us. And indeed debate what actions we think constitute whatever it is we're talking about, whether it's bullying or discrimination of one form or another. My point is that our reason for being is to be debating these things, and we mustn't tolerate people telling us what to think.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'll take one final question. Yes, the member there.
Vice Chancellor, thank you very much for your speech. When you were appointed Vice Chancellor, you said that you felt that Oxford was going to get left behind. You knew that Oxford was slow to modernize, but that the world was moving very fast and that it needed to modernize. At the end of your tenure, do you feel that you've achieved the objectives that you had then for modernization? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I don't think I said it hadn't. I said if we didn't change, we would be left behind. And I think and I'm resistant to the notion that it's the end of my tenure because I've got another good year left and there's lots to be done. But I think we have achieved a great deal, and I think there's a lot more to be done. When I set out that agenda, I'd have to look at it again. I mean, one of the things I haven't tackled is the governance structure. I think that's what I was probably referring to, the fact that we have a very complicated, I think I used the word sclerotic, governance structure. But it hasn't proven to be as big an impediment as I thought it would be. And I have to say, I think during the pandemic, we surprised ourselves with the flexibility and alacrity with which we managed to respond university-wide. So ask me that question in another year, and I'll tell you if I'm satisfied with what I've done. But I do appreciate your effort to answer the question. I didn't come in here with answers to the problem I was describing. I was hoping to get some suggestions of what we can do. So I appreciate your effort to provide them, though I hope you're right that it'll blow over. I'm not confident that it will.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Please join me once again to thank Vice Chancellor Professor Louise Richardson for joining us.